The words struck her with the force of a physical blow, though her expression did not so much as flicker. It was a skill she had perfected over years of practice. The art of receiving pain as if it were a dull report on the weather. I engaged you for a season, not forever. The Duke of Carmere, Tobias Vane, stood by the hearth, one hand braced against the cold marble of the mantelpiece. The fire had burned low, casting more shadow than light, and it seemed to steal the warmth from his voice, leaving only the hard, unyielding granite of his meaning. His face, usually a mask of controlled composure, was tight with a strain she had never seen before. It was the look of a man pulling a vital thread from a tapestry, knowing it might unravel the whole design, but compelled to do it all the same. She, Beatrice, Duchess of Carmere, by the driest of legal contracts, merely inclined her head. Her hands, hidden in the folds of her gray wool dress, were perfectly still. Inside her kid gloves, her fingers were laced so tightly together the knuckles ached. They were in his study, a room that smelled of old leather beeswax and the ghosts of cold cigars. It was a fortress of a room, and for the past 6 months, she had been its most unwelcome and yet most necessary occupant. The silence that followed his pronouncement was thick and suffocating. It was a silence made of everything not being said, of the 2 sleeping children upstairs, of the hostile whispers of his late wife's family, of the fragile, unlooked-for peace that had begun to settle over the frost-bound stones of Harrowmere House. He had said it. He had finally given voice to the cold bargain that lay beneath the velvet and titles a season. A single circumscribed block of time in which she was to perform a function, to bring order to his chaotic household, to placate the trustees who oversaw his children's inheritance, and to be a bulwark against the suffocating grief that had turned his home into a mausoleum. The season was now turning. Winter was loosening its grip on the parkland outside, the first shy snowdrops piercing the frozen earth. Her purpose, it seemed, was nearing its end. But a season is a long time in a cold house, child, and a heart is a slower thing to thaw than the most stubborn winter ground. And to understand how Beatrice had come to be standing in that room, her hands steady, when her world had just been torn from its moorings, you must go back to the beginning of that winter, to a time before she was a duchess of any kind at all. 6 months earlier, Beatrice was not a duchess. She was not even a person of consequence. She was a fixture, an object, a piece of useful but unnoticed furniture in the stifling London townhouse of her aunt, Lady Danbury. Her official title was a companion, a word that tasted of charity and obligation. In practice, she was an unpaid housekeeper, a secretary, and a silent repository for her aunt's endless litany of complaints. Her own story was a ghost that haunted her. She had been a debutante once, years ago, full of the quiet, foolish hope of a girl who has only ever read about the world in books. But a lie, a vicious and carefully constructed falsehood, whispered by a spurned suitor, had shattered her reputation as cleanly as a stone shatters glass. She was ruined. Not in a dramatic, scandalous way that might have at least been interesting, but in the quiet, smothering way of polite society. She became a poor Beatrice, the girl with the unfortunate shadow hanging over her. The invitations dwindled, the suitors vanished, and she had retreated into the gray twilight of her aunt's household, learning to make herself small and indispensable, self-sufficient, the word for a horse that does not need to be fed. One bleak November afternoon, she was in her aunt's morning room, carefully mending a tear in a lace curtain. The light was failing and the coals in the grate hissed with damp. Lady Danbury was holding court, her voice a sharp, percussive instrument slicing through the gloom. Her guests were 2 other women of her vintage, their faces powdered into masks of perpetual disapproval. The man is a block of ice," Lady Danbury declared, snapping her fan shut. They say the fires at Harrowmere have not been properly lit since the Duchess Eleanor died. He walks through society like a ghost at his own funeral, and the children," one of the cronies chimed in, her voice a conspiratorial whisper, My cousin is, maid, heard from the Harrowmere laundress, that the boy is a terror, and the little girl, well, she does not speak. Not a word, poor mite. Beatrice kept her eyes on her needle, her stitches small and even. She had heard the whispers about the Duke of Carmere. A widower for 2 years, a man of immense power and wealth, who had sealed himself and his children away in his vast, cold, country estate. He was a cautionary tale, a subject of morbid gossip, a figure as remote and forbidding as the granite cliffs on which his house was built. A sharp rap at the front door interrupted the flow of gossip. A moment later, the butler, a man whose face was a study in practiced neutrality, appeared at the door. "His Grace the Duke of Carmere, to see you, my lady." A collective intake of breath fluttered through the room. Lady Danbury sat bolt upright, her composure momentarily fractured. The Duke of Carmere did not make social calls. He did not appear unannounced in the dreary morning rooms of aging widows. He entered the room and it was as if the temperature dropped by several degrees. Tobias Vane was taller than she had imagined, broad-shouldered in a coat of severe black wool that seemed to absorb the room's meager light. His face was all sharp angles and forbidding planes, his dark hair showing no sign of powder, his eyes a startling pale gray. They were the color of the sea in winter, and they missed nothing. He noticed the dust on the side table. He noticed the slight tremor in Lady Danbury's hand as she extended it. He noticed the way Beatrice, in her corner by the window, did not look up from her sewing, her posture unchanged. His bow to her aunt was a model of chilly propriety. He endured the introductions to the other ladies with an air of profound impatience. Then his gaze, sweeping the room as if searching for an escape, settled on Beatrice. For a single, unnerving second, their eyes met. She saw in his a weariness so profound it was almost a physical weight. He saw in hers not fear, not deference, but a calm, assessing stillness. He gave a fractional nod, a bare acknowledgement of her existence, before turning back to her aunt. "Lady Danbury," he said, his voice a low baritone that held no warmth. "I have come on a matter of some urgency. I would speak with you, alone." The cronies were dismissed with a flurry of rustling silk and resentful glances. Beatrice made to follow, to melt back into the shadows where she belonged, but his voice stopped her. "Missa Ashton, please remain." Beatrice paused, her hand on the back of her chair. Her aunt shot her a look of pure astonishment mingled with suspicion. Beatrice simply returned to her seat, picked up her sewing, and waited. The quiet scratch of her needle was the only sound for a long moment. The Duke did not waste time with pleasantries. He had inherited more debts of feeling than of money, and had discharged both badly. "Find myself in need of a wife," he stated the words, as bald and unadorned as a surgeon's diagnosis. Lady Danbury's eyes widened. A calculating gleam entered them. She had several unmarried nieces of impeccable reputation and empty pockets. She began to formulate a list. Your Grace," she began, her voice syrupy. A most understandable position. A man of your station of children to consider. I have a niece, the daughter of Lorda. I am not seeking a love match, madama," the Duke cut in, his tone sharp enough to slice through her ambitions. "I require a duchess. The trustees of my late wife's estate have become insistent. They believe my household lacks a woman's hand, that my children are suffering for it. They threaten to intervene, to appoint co-guardians. I will not have it. I need to be married by the end of the month." He paced before the fireplace, a caged wolf in a too small room. The marriage will be a business arrangement, a contract. The lady in question will have the protection of my name, a generous settlement, and full authority over the domestic running of my home. In return, she will present a respectable and stable front to the world, manage my household, and to be present for the children. Nothing more will be asked or offered. Lady Danbury was practically vibrating with excitement. This was a prize beyond her wildest imaginings. She could install one of her own in one of the great houses of England. But the Duke was not looking at her. His winter grey eyes were fixed, once again, on Beatrice. "I have made my inquiries," he said slowly. "I have been told your niece, Miss Ashton, is a woman of sense, discretion, and fortitude." He paused, and his gaze flickered to the perfectly mended lace in her hands. "I saw you once, madam, at a music-hale last spring." Lady Ashworth fainted. There was chaos. "You were the only person in the room who seemed to know what to do. You did not scream or flap your hands. You loosened her stays and called for water." I noticed effort. Beatrice's needle stopped. She looked up, truly, meeting his gaze for the first time. He had seen her. In a room full of glittering society, a powerful duke had noticed the ruined spinster in the corner doing a practical, necessary thing. The shock of it was a small, sharp pain beneath her ribs. He turned his full attention to her, ignoring her sputtering aunt completely. Miss Ashton," he said, his voice direct, stripped of all social artifice. I am offering you the position of Duchess of Carmere. Will you consider it? The room went utterly still. The air crackled. Lady Danbury looked as if she might faint herself. Beatrice felt a strange, dizzying lightness, as if the floor had dropped away beneath her. A poor gentlewoman with opinions is a luxury no household can afford. She had lived by that rule for a decade. But this man was not offering her a place in a household. He was offering her the command of one. She placed her sewing carefully in her basket. She stood, her spine straight. She looked not at her aunt, but at the Duke. Your Grace, she said, her voice quiet, but clear as a bell. "I will consider your proposal. But I will not discuss it here. If you are serious, you will meet me tomorrow at the lending library on Fleet Street at 10 o'clock. Alone." And with that she walked from the room, leaving behind a stunned silence and the most powerful man in the county, who was looking for the first time in a very long time, utterly and completely taken by surprise. The lending library was a sanctuary of quiet and the scent of paper and ink. It was Beatrice's one refuge, a place where she was not a poor Beatrice, but simply a reader. She arrived early, clad in her plainest dress, her face pale but composed. He was already there. He stood among the towering shelves of books, looking impossibly large and out of place, a hawk in a dovecoat. He had dismissed the librarian with a look. They were alone. He did not offer her a seat. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable. You set terms," he stated. "It was not a question." "I do?" she replied, her voice even awed. "Before I answer anything, you will tell me the truth. All of it. I do not bargain with half a story." A flicker of something annoyance perhaps, or respect crossed his face. He gave a curt nod. Ask the trustees," she began. Why now?" "Your wife has been gone for 2 years. And my wife's sister, Lady Honora," he said, his jaw tightening. "She has been poisoning their ears. She believes she should have guardianship of the children. She says the house is in chaos, that they are neglected. She is not entirely wrong. I have had 6 governesses in 2 years. None have stayed. Why, my son, Arthur, is 10. He is a protective of his mother's memory. He drives them away. My daughter Alara is 6. She does not speak. 2, he said, the words flatly, as if reciting facts from a report, but Beatrice heard the hairline crack of pain beneath the surface. She has not spoken since her mother died. 2, grief is a patient architect, building walls brick by silent brick. This man lived in a house made of them. "And you believe a wifey will solve this?" she asked, her gaze steady. "I believe a duchess with full authority will stop the gossip, satisfy the trustees, and put an end to Honora's meddling." He corrected her. What happens within the walls of Harrowmere, after that is the substance of our bargain." She walked slowly along a shelf, trailing her fingers over the leather spines of the books. This was the moment. The precipice. She could retreat into the gray safety of her life, or she could take this impossible leap. She turned to face him. Ades. I agree. These are my conditions. He inclined his head, waiting. First, she said, I will have absolute authority over the household and the nursery. No interference. Not from you, not from your staff, and most especially, not from your sister-in-law. Her access to the children will be at my discretion. He raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. A second. I will have access to all household accounts and ledgers. I will not be a figurehead presiding over a dinner table. I will run your house. Done, he said, his voice clipped a third. She continued. And this was the hardest part. She took a breath. Your late wife. Memory will be honored. Her portrait will remain. Her rooms, if you wish, will remain. I will not be a replacement, and I will not pretend to be one. The children will be allowed to grieve her, to speak of her, and they will never be forced to accept me. They may call me whatever they wish for, as long as they wish. A profound stillness fell over him. He looked at her, and for the first time, the mask of the cold duke seemed to slip. He was seeing not a solution, but a woman of unexpected substance. He had come seeking a manager and found, to his astonishment, a strategist with a heart. You have thought this through, he said quietly. I've had a great deal of time for thought in my life. Your Grace, she replied, a hint of dry irony touching her lips. It is an occupation that requires no fortune, as she held his gaze. Done flinching, and my final condition. I am aware of my own history, of the whispers that follow my name. You will never, in public or in private, make me feel that I am anything less than your Duchess. I will not enter your house as decoration, to be ignored until needed. I will be your partner in this arrangement, or I will not do it at all. He was silent for a full minute, studying her face as if it were a map to a foreign country. He had expected a grateful, pliable poor relation. He had found a woman who knew her own worth, even if the world did not, and he realized, with a jolt that went deeper than he cared to admit, that this was exactly what he needed. Not pliability but strength, not gratitude but integrity. Very well, he said at last. The words were quiet, but they landed with the weight of a vow. Your conditions are accepted. All of them. He took a step closer. We will be married by special license at the end of the week. Be ready. And so, Beatrice Ashton, the ruined debutante, the spinster companion, became the Duchess of Carmere. She walked into Harrowmere House on a bitter December day, when the sky was the color of slate and the trees were skeletal against the clouds. The house was even colder, inside, than out. It was not a physical chill, though the fires did seem sullen and reluctant. It was a coldness of the soul, a silence that was not peaceful, but heavy, weighted with unspoken sorrow. Footsteps echoed too loudly on the marble floors. The vast rooms were shrouded in dust sheets, as if the house itself were in mourning. The air was thick with the scent of lavender and disuse. The staff lined up to meet her, their faces a mixture of curiosity and deep-seated skepticism. She was the seventh woman to try to tame this desolate house. They did not expect her to last the winter. The housekeeper, a formidable woman named Mrs. Besser. Gable had eyes like chips of flint. Your Grace, she said, her curtsy stiff and correct. There was no welcome in her voice. Beatrice met her gaze, calmly. Mrs. Gable, we will have much to discuss. For now, please have my things taken to my rooms, and have the dust sheets removed from the morning room. We will begin by letting in the light. A flicker of surprise in the housekeeper's eyes. She had expected a timid mouse or a demanding peacock. This quiet, self-possessed woman was neither. The children were the true test. She found them in the nursery, a vast, cheerless room at the top of the house. Arthur, the boy, stood by the window, his back to her. He was small for his age, but his shoulders were rigid with defiance. He did not turn. Alara, the little girl, was curled in a large armchair almost lost in its depths. She was a tiny, fragile thing, with her featheris pale gray eyes and a cloud of dark hair. She clutched a small, tarnished silver music box in her lap, her thumb rubbing a pattern over its lid. She looked at Beatrice with an unnerving, silent appraisal, her gaze ancient in her small face. Beatrice did not rush toward them. She did not coo or offer false smiles. She simply stood in the doorway for a moment, taking them in dar. A good afternoon, she said, her voice soft. My name is Beatrice. Arthur did not move. Alara blinked, her grip tightening on the music box. Beatrice walked over to the tall mullioned window, its panes latticed with frost. Outside, the parkland stretched away, a monochrome landscape of gray and white. Your father tells me you are fond of books. Arthur, she said, her back still to him. The library, here is said to be one of the finest in the north. A small, grudging sound from the boy. Not a word, but a noise of acknowledgement. She turned her attention to the little girl. She knelt, not too close, so she was at Alara's level. That is a beautiful music box, she said gently. Alara hugged it to her chest, her expression wary. I will not take it, Beatrice assured her. It is yours to keep. Always. And then she left them. She did not press. She did not demand. She understood that trust in a house like this was not a thing to be seized, but a seed to be planted in frozen ground, to be tended with patience and quiet consistency. The days that followed were a silent battle of wills. Lady Honora, the Duca's sister-in-law, was a constant, unnerving presence. She was a handsome woman, with the same gray eyes as the Duke, but hers were sharp and brittle, where his were deep and weary. She had made Harrowmere her second home since her sister's death, and she viewed Beatrice as an usurper. The dear children are so sensitive, Honora would say, her voice dripping with false concern, always in earshot of the servants. They need familiarity, stability, not a upheaval. Beatrice never rose to the bait. She met Honora's passive aggressions with unruffling politeness. When Honora countermanded an order to the cook, Beatrice quietly but firmly reinstated it. When Honora tried to dismiss the children as new younger governess, woman Beatrice had hired for her warmth and patience, Beatrice met with her in the study. A Lady Honora, she said, her tone level. The staff of this house are my responsibility. You are a guest here, you will behave as one he. Honora's eyes glittered with fury. I am their aunt. I am all they have left of their mother, and I am their father's wife, Beatrice replied, her voice dropping to a steely quiet. You lost that authority the moment you introduced me as hired help. Do not test me again. Honora retreated, but Beatrice knew it was only a temporary sixth hire. The war was far from over. With the children, she employed a different strategy: patience. She learned that Arthur was not merely angry. He was intelligent and bored. The tutors his father had hired had treated him like a problem to be managed. Beatrice found him in the library one afternoon, poring over a book of architectural drawings. She did not comment on his rudeness in ignoring her. Instead, she found a more advanced text on Roman aqueducts and left it on the table beside him without a word. The next day, she saw him reading it, a look of fierce concentration on his face. With Alara, she was simply present. She would bring her needlework to the nursery and sit in a chair by the fire, sewing in silence for an hour at a time. She never demanded a response. She would speak to her, occasionally, gentle, observational things. The snow is falling very thickly today. Or Mrs. Gable's cat seems to have found a patch of sun. One day, Alara dropped her precious music box. It clattered to the floor, and a tiny decorative hinge broke. The girl's face crumpled, her eyes filling with silent, terrified tears. Before the governess could rush in, Beatrice was there. She knelt and picked up the two small pieces. It is not ruined, she said softly. See, the pin has just come loose. We can fix this. She took the box not to a jeweler, but to the estate's clockmaker, an old man with clever, gnarled hands. She sat with him for 2 hours, while he patiently repaired the delicate mechanism. When she returned it to Alara, the little girl stared at the mended box, then up at Beatrice. For the first time, the wary defensiveness in her eyes softened into something else, something like wonder. The Duke watched it all from a distance. Men are slow, child, and dukes are slowest of all, and grief makes fools of the cleverest of us. He had made a bargain for a housekeeper in a Duchess's coronet. He had not anticipated this quiet, steady campaign of competence and kindness. He found himself seeking her out. He would take his paperwork to the library in the evenings, where she often sat reading. They rarely spoke more than a few words, but the silence between them was not the heavy, oppressive silence that filled the rest of the house. It was a comfortable, companionable quiet. He noticed the changes in his home. There were flowers in the vases now, simple winter jasmine and hothouse roses. The fires burned brightly. The scent of baking bread sometimes drifted up from the kitchens. The servants still watched her, but their skepticism was being replaced by a grudging respect. Mrs. Gable had even been heard to remark that her grace had a head for figures that would shame a London banker. He had engaged her to manage his house. He had not expected her to begin, slowly and painstakingly, to mend his home. The realization was unsettling. It made him feel vulnerable. It made him feel as though the careful walls he had built around his heart were being tested, not by a siege, but by the patient, persistent growth of ivy, finding its way into the cracks. The thaw, when it came, began with a crisis. A fever swept through the district, a vicious influenza that paid no mind to rank or title. It found its way into the nursery at Harrowmere, and it seized upon Alara. The little girl burned with a terrifying heat. The local doctor came and went, muttering about weak constitutions and the will of Providence. He prescribed useless powders and advised keeping her warm. Lady Honora wrung her hands and spoke of her dear departed sister, turning the childish illness into a drama about her own grief. The Duke paced his study, his face a grim, gray mask of helplessness. He had lost his wife. The thought of losing his daughter was an abyss he could not bear to look into. It was Beatrice who took command. She moved into the nursery, dismissing the flustered governess and a weeping housemaid. She had seen this fever before. She knew its patterns, its deceptions. She sent a rider for ice from the Estateus ice house. She brewed willow bark tea to bring down the fever. She bathed Alara's small, hot body with cool cloths, murmuring to her, her voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of the child's delirium. For 2 days and 2 nights, she did not leave the room. She barely slept, dozing in a chair by the bed. The Duke would appear in the doorway, his eyes shadowed with fear and exhaustion, looking like a ghost in his own house. "You should rest," he would say, his voice rough. "She needs me," a Beatrice would reply, simply, wringing out a cloth and a basin of cool water. On the 3rd night, the fever reached its crisis. Alara's breathing was shallow, her skin terrifyingly hot to the touch. The doctor had given up hope. Honora was weeping in the hall. The Duke stood by the bed, his hands clenched into useless fists, his face etched with a despair so profound it seemed to age him a decade. Beatrice was calm. Her movements were efficient, her face set in lines of fierce concentration. She was no longer a duchess or a companion. She was a woman fighting for a child's life. In the darkest hour just before dawn, Alara began to shiver violently. Her fever-bright eyes fluttered open. She looked around, confused, her gaze finally settling on Beatrice's face, which was pale and shadowed in the lamplight. A single whispered word escaped the child's chapped lips. It was the first word she had spoken in 2 years. A sing. A Beatrice's breath caught. She looked at the Duke, whose face was a study in stunned disbelief. She began to sing, her voice at first hesitant and husky with fatigue, then growing stronger. It was an old lullaby, a simple tune about stars and sleeping lambs. She sang it over and over, her hand stroking Alara's damp hair. The shivering subsided, the child's breathing deepened, becoming even and regular. She fell into the first true healing sleep she had known in days. The fever had broken. The Duke looked at Beatrice, who was still softly humming, her eyes fixed on the sleeping child. He saw the exhaustion carved into her face, the smudge of soot on her cheek, the fierce, protective tenderness in her expression. And in that moment, the last of his carefully constructed walls came crashing down. This was not a bargain. This was not a contract. This woman had just saved his daughter's life with a steadiness he had never known. He reached out, his hand covering hers, where it rested on the coverlet. His touch was warm, firm, and startlingly gentle. "A Beatrice," he said, and his voice was thick with an emotion he could not name. "A thank you." She looked up at him, her eyes weary but clear. She gave a small, tired nod. They stayed like that for a long moment, their hands clasped over the sleeping child, the silence in the room no longer heavy with grief, but filled with a fragile, dawning peace. The long winter of Harrowmere was beginning to break. The change in the house was palpable. Elara recovered slowly, but the silence that had imprisoned her was broken. She began to speak again, at first in single words, then in hesitant sentences. Her first full sentence, whispered to Beatrice a week after the fever, was, "Will you read to me?" Arthur, who had watched Beatrice's tireless vigil with a mixture of suspicion and awe, began to shed his angry armor. He started seeking her out, ostensibly to ask questions about his studies, but really, Beatrice suspected, just to be in her presence. He even, one astonishing afternoon, defended her against his aunt. "A Lady Beatrice knows more about Roman history than my tutor," he declared hotly, when Honora made a slighting remark about Beatrice's education. She is not a fool." Her influence, once absolute, was dissolving. The children were turning to the stranger. The staff now looked to Beatrice for orders, not her. The way the Duke looked at his new wife was no longer the dispassionate gaze of a man assessing an employee. There was a new warmth in it, a respect that bordered on something deeper. Honora was a woman who did not relinquish power gracefully. If she could not rule through affection, she would rule through fear. She decided it was time to deploy her final weapon. It was time to remind everyone, especially the Duke, exactly who and what he had brought into their lives. She requested a private interview with him in his study. She came armed with a sheaf of letters and an expression of profound, sorrowful duty. "Ah, Tobias," she began, her voice trembling with manufactured sincerity, "I do this only out of love for my sainted sister and her precious children. I have made inquiries about the Duchess." She laid her poison carefully. She spoke of the scandal that had ruined Beatrice's debut, twisting the facts, embellishing the lies. She painted a picture of a desperate, morally compromised woman who had schemed her way into a title. "A woman of her character cannot be a mother to Eleanor's children," she finished, her eyes shining with righteous tears, "as she will bring shame and ruin upon this house. You must send her away for the children's sake." The Duke listened, his face impassive, but inside him a cold dread was spreading. He had known of the rumors, of course, but had dismissed them as malicious gossip. To hear them laid out so starkly, by a woman he had trusted, it struck at the very heart of his own deepest fears. The fear of failure. The fear of making another mistake. The fear that he, in his desperation, had endangered the very children he sought to protect. Grief and fear are terrible counselors. They whisper old lies and make them sound like new truths. When Honora left, the Duke was not thinking of the quiet competence of his wife, or the way she had sung his daughter back to life. He was thinking of the trustees, of his family name, of the cold, hard judgment of the world. He sent for Beatrice. She entered the study and knew at once that something was wrong. The fragile warmth that had begun to grow between them was gone, replaced by a chilling formality. He stood by the hearth, just as he had on that first day in London, a forbidding, remote figure. And it was then, with his heart in the grip of an old, cold fear, that he spoke the words that would echo in her mind for months to come. This was a business arrangement, Beatrice. A temporary measure to satisfy the trustees. Ta! He could not meet her eyes. He stared into the dying embers of the fire. I engaged you for a season, not forever. Her heart, which had so foolishly begun to hope, felt as if it had turned to ice in her chest. She had known the terms, she had set them herself. But she had not understood how much it would hurt to have them thrown back in her face. I engaged you for a season, not forever. The words became a cruel refrain in the quiet moments of her days. She heard them when she tucked Alara into bed at night. She heard them when she helped Arthur with a difficult passage of Latin. She heard them in the lonely expanse of her grand, cold bedroom. But here's the thing about a woman like Beatrice. The world had tried to break her once before, and it had failed. It had taught her that dignity was not something bestowed by others, but something you carried inside yourself. She was wounded, yes, but she was not broken. She had made a promise, not just to the Duke, but to the children and to herself. She had promised to be a partner in this arrangement, and the season was not yet over. She continued her duties with the same quiet efficiency as before. She did not retreat. She did not weep. She met the Duca's new, formal distance with a cool, unbreachable composure of her own. If he wanted a business arrangement, then that was what he would have. She would fulfill her side of the bargain to the letter. She stayed. The Duke, meanwhile, was living in his own private hell. The moment the cruel words had left his lips, he had been consumed by a self-loathing so intense, it was a physical sickness. He saw the flicker of pain in her eyes before she had shuddered it away, and the image haunted him. He had taken her strength, her kindness, her courage, and repaid it with the cowardice of a frightened man. He did something he had not done in years. He began to ask questions. He sent his solicitor to London, not to investigate Beatrice, but to investigate the old scandal itself. He was a man who dealt in facts, and he realized, to his shame, that he had acted on the venomous innuendo of a jealous woman. The day of the trustee's visit arrived. It was a crisp day in early spring, the air holding the clean, sharp scent of thawed earth. Sir Walter Finch and Mr. Armitage, the two trustees, were stern, sober-faced men who carried the weight of their responsibility like a shroud. Lady Honora was there, of course, hovering like a vulture, her face a mask of pious concern. They convened in the grand drawing-room. Beatrice had ordered the heavy velvet curtains pulled back, and the room was filled with pale, watery sunlight. She served tea herself, her movements graceful and composed. She was the picture of a serene and capable duchess. The trustees were polite but formal. They asked questions about the household accounts, about the children's tutors, about the running of the estate. Beatrice answered them all, her responses clear, concise, and backed by a formidable knowledge of every detail. Mrs. Gable, standing by the door, watched with an expression of profound, grudging admiration. Then, Honora made her move. "Sirs," she said, her voice trembling delicately. "A Hala Duchess is no doubt a efficienta. There are matters of character which must be considered. Matters of moral fitness, to raise my dear sister's children." She began to spin her tale, the story of Beatrice's ruin, presenting it as established fact. Sir Walter's face grew grave. Mr. Armitage shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The air in the room grew thick and cold. Beatrice listened, without interruption. When Honora had finished, a triumphant, malicious gleam in her eye, all eyes turned to Beatrice. The room was silent. This was the moment. The public reckoning. Beatrice placed her teacup carefully on its saucer. She looked directly at Sir Walter. "That is what was said of me." "Yes," she said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "It was not, however, what happened." She did not raise her voice. She did not defend herself with hysterics or denials. She simply met their judgment with the calm force of her own integrity. She had learned long ago that protesting Juana's innocence too loudly only made one sound more guilty. And if I were to disagree with your assessment, Honora sneered. Before Beatrice could reply, the Duke spoke. He had been standing by the window, silent and watchful. Now, he moved to stand beside his wife's chair. You would be disagreeing with the facts. Honora, he said, his voice low and dangerous. He held a letter in his hand. My solicitor has been in London. He has obtained a full, signed confession from Lord Albright, the man who started these rumors. He admits he lied. To protect himself from a gambling debt he owed Miss Ashton's father, he ruined an innocent young woman's name to save his own. He placed the letter on the table. The silence in the room was now absolute stunned. Honora's face went white. A cruelty seems already abundant this evening, the Duke said, his cold gaze fixed on his sister-in-law. I see no reason to add mine. You will leave my house now. And you will not return. But the true vindication did not come from the Duke. It came from the doorway. Arthur and Alara stood there. They were not supposed to be present, but they had slipped away from their governess, drawn by the raised voices. Arthur stepped forward, his young face set. A Lady Beatrice is not what you say, he announced, his voice clear and defiant. She found my mother's book of pressed flowers. She said we should always keep the things we love. She taught me how to read the estate maps. She said I had a good head for it. Then Alara, who is still shy around strangers, did the bravest thing she had ever done. She walked across the vast room, right past the sputtering Lady Honora and the astonished trustees. She walked directly to Beatrice's chair. She laid her small hand on Beatrice's arm, and she looked up at her gray eyes wide and serious, and said the one word that changed everything. A stay. It was not a request. It was a declaration, a choice made, out loud in front of everyone. In that single word, the bargain was broken, the contract dissolved, and something new and real was forged in its place. The trustees stared, their stern faces softening. A home was not a matter of ledgers and bloodlines. It was a matter of who stayed the room, which had moments before been a courtroom, was now simply a family's drawing room, and Lady Honora was an intruder in it. She fled without another word, defeated, not by the Duke's power or a solicitor's letter, but by the simple, undeniable truth spoken by a child. Later that evening, after the trustees had departed with reassurances and apologies, Beatrice sat alone in the library. The fire was burning brightly, and the room was warm and quiet. She felt a profound weariness, the deep exhaustion that follows a long-fought battle. She had won. Her name was cleared. Her place was secure. But the Duke's cold words still lay like a shard of ice in her heart. He found her there. He did not speak at first, simply stood watching her from the doorway. He was stripped of his ducal armor, his face unguarded and raw with emotion. He looked, she thought, like the man she had glimpsed on that first day, the man drowning in a grief too heavy to carry alone. He walked over to the fireplace and stood beside her chair. "I was a coward," he said, his voice rough. He did not look at her, but at the flames. What Honora said, it did not matter if it was true. It frightened me, and I hurt you because I was afraid. There is no excuse for it. Dotch. He turned to face her, and his winter eyes were filled with a desperate, aching sincerity. A grief makes a fortress of a man, Beatrice, and for 2 years I have been locked inside. I forgot how to open the gates. I thought if I kept you at a distance, kept this as a season, it would not hurt when you left, and now, she whispered. And now I find the thought of you leaving unbearable, he said, the words torn from him. You walked into this cold, silent house, and you filled it with light. You gave me back my children. You gave me back myself. You became the heart of this house. He knelt before her, taking her hands in his. I love you, Beatrice. Not as part of a bargain, not for a season. I love you. She looked down at their joined hands. Her heart ached with a feeling so powerful it was almost painful. It was hope, terrifying and beautiful. But the wound was still there. Do not say it if it is only gratitude. Tobias, she said, her voice trembling slightly, I have had enough of being useful. A gratitude. He gave a short, harsh laugh. I am grateful for the air I breathe, but I do not love it. I love you for your courage, for your quiet strength, for the way you see the world, for the way you saw me, not as a duke, but as a man who was lost. 2. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of parchment. It was their marriage settlement, the cold, hard contract that had defined their lives for 6 months. With a single, decisive movement, he tore it in two and dropped the pieces into the fire. They curled, blackened, and vanished into ash. The season is over, he said softly, his eyes never leaving hers. This is forever, if you will have it. If you will have me. She looked into his face, and she saw her future. Not a life of ease or of title, but a life of shared burdens and shared joys. A life of warmth and laughter in the halls of a house that was no longer cold. Ah, I will, she whispered. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound, bone-deep tenderness. It was a kiss of homecoming, a promise not of a season, but of a lifetime. A year later, Beatrice stood on the terrace at Harrowmere. It was a glorious spring afternoon, and the gardens, which had been neglected for so long, were bursting with life and color. The air was warm, and the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. Behind her, the French doors to the drawing room were open, and the sound of laughter spilled out onto the terrace. Ilara, her voice now clear and confident, was chattering to her governess. Arthur was deep in conversation with his father, pointing at a set of architectural plans for a new folly in the gardens. The house that had once been a tomb was now truly a home. Beatrice rested a hand on the gentle swell of her stomach. A new life was coming to Harrowmere, a child of love, not of bargains. Tobias came to stand beside her, slipping an arm around her waist. He followed her gaze out over the blooming gardens. The late Dagius portrait still hung in the long gallery, a place of honor. Her memory was not a ghost to be feared, but a gentle presence to be respected. Beatrice had not replaced her. She had simply allowed the house to live. Again. Ah, it was beautiful, is not it? She said softly. Ah, the spring. He smiled, a real warm smile that reached his eyes and transformed his stern face. He leaned down and kissed her temple. I told you once that I engaged you for a season, he murmured against her hair, his voice full of a love that was as steady and enduring as the ancient stones of the house around them. But you, my love, you were the one who brought the spring. She had come for a season. A bargain struck in desperation and grief. But she had stayed through the winter, and she had brought the thaw. She was not the duchess of a season. She was the woman who had made a house, a home, a family whole, and a guarded duca's heart, finally, and forever, her own. What do you think is the hardest thing to heal? A broken heart or a broken home? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from you, and it truly helps our stories reach more people who might need them. If this tale of patience and love warmed your heart, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to our channel for more stories like this one. Every comment and subscription lets us know we're on the right track. Tell us where you are watching from today. We have viewers from all over the world, and it is a joy to see where our stories land. Thank you for spending your time with us. We'll be back soon with another story for you. Until then, be well.